The ceremonial hall at Naval Station Norfolk buzzed with the controlled energy of a graduation ceremony. Families gathered in neat rows, while officers in crisp dress blues maintained perfect military bearing. In the third row, 78-year-old Ezra Holloway adjusted his weathered navy jacket with trembling fingers, his walking stick resting against the chair, as he watched his grandson Danny stand proudly among the graduating class. The jacket hung loose on his diminished frame, the fabric bearing decades of careful mending. His watery blue eyes tracked Danny's movements with evident pride, a soft smile creasing his deeply lined face. Around him, other military families chatted quietly, their conversations mixing anticipation with ceremony protocols. "Excuse me, sir." The voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Commander Bradley Vance loomed over Ezra, his chest full of ribbons catching the overhead lights. "You're in a restricted area." Ezra looked up slowly, his arthritic neck protesting the movement. "I'm here for my grandson's graduation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the whisper of age. "Danny Holloway, third row center." Vance's eyes narrowed as they swept over Ezra's jacket, noting the faded anchors on the collar and the way the old man sat with unconscious military posture despite his frailty. "Where did you get that jacket?" "It's mine," Ezra replied simply, his weathered hands folding over the walking stick's handle. The gesture revealed glimpses of faded scars across his knuckles, old marks that spoke of harder times. "Stolen valor is a federal crime," Vance announced loudly enough for nearby families to hear. Conversation stopped as heads turned toward the confrontation. "I need to see your military identification." Ezra's breathing grew slightly labored, but he maintained his dignity. "I don't carry my old ID anymore, been out of service for many years." "Then you have no business wearing that uniform." Vance's voice rose, drawing more attention. Several officers began gravitating toward the disturbance, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. "Stand up now." The old man struggled to his feet, his walking stick shaking slightly as he leveraged himself upward. The movement was painful to watch, each motion deliberate and careful, yet even in his obvious frailty, something in his bearing suggested this wasn't always how he moved through the world. "Grandfather, what's happening?" Danny had broken from formation, his young face flushed with concern and embarrassment as he approached. "Return to your position, sailor," Vance snapped without taking his eyes off Ezra. "Your grandfather here seems to be playing dress-up." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several family members shifted uncomfortably, while veteran fathers in the audience exchanged glances. This wasn't how military ceremonies were supposed to proceed. Ezra placed a gentle hand on Danny's arm. "It's all right, son. Go back to your ceremony." But Vance wasn't finished. "No, I think everyone here should understand what real service looks like versus what we have here." He gestured dismissively at Ezra. "Front and center. Let's discuss your supposed military career." The old man's shoulders sagged slightly, but he moved forward with careful steps, his walking stick tapping against the polished floor. The sound echoed in the increasingly quiet hall as hundreds of eyes focused on the unfolding drama. In the front row, Lieutenant Sarah Chen found herself studying the elderly man's movements, noting something that didn't quite align with his apparent frailty. That morning, Ezra had stood before his bedroom mirror, carefully pressing the navy jacket with hands that remembered every crease. On his dresser sat a small framed photo of Danny in his recruit training blues, the young man's proud smile identical to his grandfather's at that age. The jacket held memories in every thread. Salt spray from ships whose names he could never speak, desert sand from operations that officially never happened, blood from wounds that earned no Purple Hearts because the missions didn't exist. He'd worn it perhaps a dozen times in 50 years, always to family military ceremonies, always wondering if this would be the time someone recognized what lay beneath the surface. Now, standing in front of the assembled crowd, Ezra felt those decades of silence weighing on his shoulders. Commander Vance circled him like a predator, his voice carrying across the ceremonial hall. "So tell us about your service, old man. What ship did you serve on? What was your rate?" Ezra's voice remained steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I served with good men, doing what needed to be done." "That's not an answer," Vance pressed. "Where? When? With whom?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Ezra could feel Danny's eyes on him, could sense his grandson's confusion and growing shame. The boy had always been proud of his grandfather's military background, even if Ezra had never shared details. Now that pride was being systematically dismantled in front of his peers and commanding officers. "I served from 1968 to 1992, Ezra said carefully. Much of it was classified work. Several people in the audience snorted softly at this claim. Classified work was often the refuge of those who hadn't actually served, or who had served in mundane capacities they wanted to make sound more important. Lieutenant Chen shifted in her seat, her intelligence training picking up subtle inconsistencies. The old man's breathing patterns suggested stress, but his positioning remained tactically sound. He'd unconsciously placed his back near the wall, maintained clear sight lines to the exits, and despite his obvious physical limitations, his movements showed traces of deeply ingrained training. "Classified work," Vance repeated mockingly. "Let me guess, you were Special Forces, a Navy SEAL perhaps." The crowd chuckled at the obvious absurdity. "Look at you. You can barely stand without that stick." Ezra's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction to the humiliation. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that momentarily silenced the room. "A man's current condition doesn't erase what he once was." The statement hung in the air with unexpected weight. Even Vance seemed momentarily taken aback by the dignity in the old man's voice. But the moment passed, and his aggression returned doubled. "Enough games, remove that jacket. You're dishonoring every real veteran in this room." The order struck the assembly like lightning. Families who had been watching with growing discomfort now sat in stunned silence. This had gone beyond military protocol into something that felt fundamentally wrong, regardless of the old man's actual service record. Danny stepped forward again, his young face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sir, please, he's my grandfather. He's not hurting anyone." "Your grandfather is committing stolen valor, sailor. That's a federal offense." Vance turned back to Ezra with theatrical authority. "I said remove it. Now." Ezra's weathered hands moved slowly to the jacket's buttons. Each movement seemed to require tremendous effort, whether from arthritis or the weight of what was happening. Around the room, other veterans began to shift uncomfortably. Whatever the truth of the old man's service, this public humiliation felt excessive. "This is wrong," Danny said quietly, but his voice carried in the silence. "He's served this country. He deserves respect. He deserves to be exposed for what he is." Vance replied coldly, "A fraud trading on the sacrifice of real heroes." As Ezra fumbled with the second button, Lieutenant Chen noticed something that made her breath catch. When the old man shifted his grip on his walking stick, his sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo, not the kind of amateur ink that many aging veterans sported, but something professionally done, formal, with clean lines that suggested military significance. Chen's training in intelligence analysis kicked into overdrive. The tattoo's position, the style, the age of the ink, all of it suggested this wasn't decoration, but identification. Her mind raced through databases of military symbols, special operations insignia, unit identifications from decades past. She found herself studying Ezra's face with new eyes, beneath the age spots and wrinkles, beneath the watery eyes and trembling hands. She glimpsed something harder. The bone structure spoke of someone who had once been formidable, the kind of weathered hardness that came not from time, but from trials that most men never faced. "Stop," she said quietly, then louder. "Commander Vance, stop this." The interruption broke the rhythm of humiliation Vance had established. He turned toward her with obvious irritation. "Lieutenant, return to your seat. This doesn't concern you." "I think it does, sir." Chen stood, her intelligence officer bearing giving weight to her words. "I believe there may be more to this situation than appears." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Explain yourself." Chen looked at Ezra, seeing the old man's slight nod of permission. "I'd like to request verification of this gentleman's service record through proper channels before we proceed further." "There are no proper channels for fraudulent claims," Vance snapped. "Then let's verify that claim, sir, properly." The confrontation had evolved into something resembling a trial, with the assembled crowd serving as an unwilling jury. Chen's intervention had introduced reasonable doubt into what Vance had presented as a clear-cut case of fraud, creating tension between military protocol and simple human decency. Chen discreetly activated her secure communication device. sending a priority message to Naval Special Warfare Archives. Her security clearance granted access to databases that regular personnel couldn't reach. Files that contained the ghost stories of naval operations stretching back decades. "Your name, sir?" she asked Ezra gently. "Ezra Holloway," he replied, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Chen's fingers moved across her device's screen, accessing archived personnel files. The initial search returned nothing, not unusual for older veterans, particularly those whose service preceded complete digitization. But Chen had learned that absence of records often told its own story, especially in special operations contexts. She expanded her search parameters, including classified databases that required additional authorization. Her credentials granted access, and she began seeing fragments, heavily redacted files that mentioned E. Holloway, in connection with operations spanning from 1968 through the early 1990s. The details were almost entirely classified, but the dates aligned with what Ezra had claimed. "Commander," she said carefully, "I'm finding archived references that suggest Mr. Holloway may indeed have served, though the details are classified beyond my clearance level." Vance's confidence wavered slightly. "What kind of references?" "Naval Special Warfare Operations. Multiple deployments across several decades." Chen paused, studying her screen. "Sir, I believe we may need to contact higher authority for verification." The admission created a ripple through the crowd. If the old man's service was real, if it was classified at levels requiring special verification, then everything about this confrontation was about to change. Ezra remained silent throughout the exchange, his dignity intact despite the ongoing humiliation, but those watching carefully noticed changes in his bearing, subtle shifts that suggested he was preparing for something. Though what remained unclear, Danny watched his grandfather with new eyes, beginning to understand that there might be depths to the old man's past that family stories had never revealed. The possibility that his shame might transform into pride created a knot of complex emotions in his chest. Chen sent another message, this one marked with priority flags that would reach the desk of Admiral Thomas Reeves within minutes. If anyone could verify or debunk Ezra Holloway's claimed service, it would be someone with access to the most classified levels of naval special operations history. "While we wait for verification," Vance said with remaining authority, "this ceremony cannot proceed with potential stolen valor on display. Security will escort this man out." But as security personnel approached, Ezra made no move to comply or resist. He simply stood with quiet dignity, waiting for whatever would come next, his weathered hand steady on his walking stick, despite everything he'd endured. The message reached Admiral Thomas Reeves as he reviewed operational reports in his Norfolk office. A decorated officer with 40 years of naval service and deep knowledge of special operations history, Reeves understood the significance of Chen's urgent but carefully worded request. SEAL veteran identity verification needed immediately. Ezra Holloway, claiming Team 3 service 1968 to 1992. The name hit Reeves like a physical blow. He had heard whispers of Ezra Holloway throughout his career, stories passed down through SEAL communities about the founding members of Team 3, operators whose classified service had shaped modern naval special warfare doctrine. If this was the same man, if he was still alive, then someone was about to make a catastrophic mistake. Reeves immediately accessed his personal secure files, databases that contained information known only to the highest levels of naval command. The record he found made his blood run cold, not because it revealed fraud, but because it confirmed the presence of a living legend being publicly humiliated. He left his office at a run, his aides scrambling to keep pace as they headed toward the ceremonial hall where a disaster was unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, the confrontation had reached its crescendo. Security personnel flanked Ezra while Vance delivered what he clearly intended as a closing statement about military integrity and the importance of honoring real veterans by exposing fraudulent ones. "This is what happens when civilians try to trade on sacrifices they never made," Vance announced to the crowd. "Real veterans earned their honors through blood, sweat, and years of dedicated service. They don't deserve to be diminished by pretenders." The speech would have been stirring if directed at an actual fraud. Instead, it served as a monument to Vance's ignorance and the danger of assumptions. In the audience, Chen continued monitoring her communications, Waiting for higher authority to intervene before irreversible damage was done, Danny had reached his breaking point, despite orders to maintain position. Despite the potential consequences to his own military career, he stepped forward to physically shield his grandfather from further humiliation. "That's enough," he said quietly but firmly. "I don't care what regulations say. This stops now." The act of defiance rippled through the assembled personnel. A young sailor risking his career to defend an elderly man created a powerful image that transcended military protocol and spoke to fundamental human decency. Vance turned his authority on Danny with obvious relish. "Sailor, you're facing disciplinary action for insubordination. Stand down immediately." "No, sir," Danny replied, his voice stronger. "Not while you're attacking my grandfather." The standoff crystallized everything wrong with the situation. A young man willing to sacrifice his career for family loyalty, an elderly man bearing humiliation with quiet dignity, and an officer so committed to his position that he couldn't recognize when he'd crossed fundamental lines of decency. Then Admiral Reeves burst through the doors. The Admiral's arrival transformed the atmosphere instantly. Conversations stopped, officers snapped to attention, and even family members sensed the shift in authority. Reeves carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels, his chest full of decorations that spoke to decades of distinguished service. His eyes swept the scene quickly, taking in the security personnel flanking Ezra, Commander Vance's theatrical positioning, Danny's protective stance, and the crowd of uncomfortable witnesses. But when his gaze fell on Ezra himself, his expression transformed completely. "Stand down," he ordered quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. "All security personnel, step back immediately." Vance, confused by the sudden intervention, attempted to maintain control. "Admiral, we're dealing with a case of stolen valor. This civilian has been impersonating." "Commander Vance," Reeves interrupted, his voice carrying warning. "I suggest you stop talking immediately." The Admiral approached Ezra with obvious respect, his bearing shifting from command authority to something approaching reverence. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried clearly across the silent hall. "Mr. Holloway," he said simply, "it's an honor to finally meet you." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. If Admiral Reeves, with his obvious knowledge and authority, was showing respect rather than enforcing military protocol, then everything they'd witnessed was about to be revealed as a tragic mistake. Ezra looked up at the younger officer with eyes that seemed to carry decades of hidden weight. "Admiral," he replied quietly, "I was hoping to avoid this kind of attention." "I'm afraid that's no longer possible," Reeves said gently. "Commander Vance has made this a public matter. With your permission, I think it's time for the truth to come out." The exchange between the two men carried undertones that most of the audience couldn't fully understand. There was history here, connections that spanned decades and operations that had shaped naval warfare in ways the public would never know. Danny watched his grandfather with growing amazement, beginning to understand that the old man he'd known his entire life had depths that family stories had never explored. The possibility that shame might transform into pride created emotions he didn't know how to process. Commander Vance stood frozen, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized he might have made a career-ending mistake. The Admiral's obvious recognition of Ezra as someone deserving respect rather than investigation suggested catastrophic misjudgment on his part. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Reeves addressed the crowd, "you are in the presence of someone whose service to this nation cannot be fully disclosed due to classification levels that remain in effect. But I can tell you that you are witnessing naval history in human form." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable, humiliation shifting toward recognition, shame becoming honor. Admiral Reeves positioned himself between Ezra and the crowd, his bearing transforming the confrontation into something resembling a ceremony. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades studying naval special operations history. "Ezra Holloway was a founding member of SEAL Team 3, he announced, his words hitting the assembly like depth charges. "His service record spans 24 years of operations that remain classified. But I can tell you that every SEAL who has served since owes something to the groundwork laid by operators like Mr. Holloway." The revelation recontextualized everything the crowd had witnessed. What had appeared to be an elderly fraud was revealed as a living piece of naval legend. Someone whose contributions to American military capability stretched back to the earliest days of modern special operations. Commander Vance's face had gone pale as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. Publicly humiliating a genuine American hero, particularly one whose service was classified at the highest levels, represented not just personal embarrassment, but potential career suicide. The reason you won't find Mr. Holloway's service record in standard databases, Reeves continued, is that his operations were classified at levels that still require special authorization to access. Men like him operated in complete secrecy, their identities protected even from other military personnel. Ezra stood quietly throughout the Admiral's explanation, his dignity intact but his discomfort obvious. Decades of living in shadow had not prepared him for public recognition, and the attention was clearly more challenging than the earlier humiliation. "With Mr. Holloway's permission," Reeves said, glancing at the older man, "I can share that SEAL Team 3's early operations included coastal reconnaissance during the Vietnam War, counterterrorism missions in the 1970s and 1980s, and operations that directly prevented terrorist attacks on American soil and American personnel overseas." Danny listened with growing amazement as his grandfather's hidden history was revealed. The quiet old man who had raised him after his parents' death, who had attended every school function and baseball game, had once been someone who operated at the highest levels of American military capability. Each mission was conducted without recognition, Reeves continued, because success meant that the American people never knew they had been in danger. For men like Mr. Holloway, serving in silence was the price of keeping our nation safe. The emotional weight of this revelation struck the crowd powerfully. They were seeing not just the vindication of one old man, but recognition of sacrifices that had been hidden for decades. The price of classified service was the inability to claim credit for the most important work of a lifetime. Ezra's weathered hands remained steady on his walking stick, but his eyes had taken on a distant quality as decades of suppressed memories surfaced. For the first time in 50 years, someone with authority was acknowledging work that had defined his life, but could never be discussed. The full weight of Commander Vance's mistake became clear as Admiral Reeves continued his revelation. What had been intended as a lesson about military integrity had become a lesson about judgment, humility, and the danger of assumptions. "Mr. Holloway," Reeves said, addressing Ezra directly, "would you be willing to show these people the symbol you've carried all these years?" Ezra hesitated. Decades of secrecy warring with the moment's demands. Finally, he nodded slowly and carefully rolled up his jacket sleeve, revealing the tattoo that Lieutenant Chen had glimpsed earlier. The SEAL trident was clearly visible now, professionally done, and showing the wear of decades beneath it. The number 3 and dates spanning from 1968 to 1992 marked years of classified service. Additional small symbols, known only to those with special operations knowledge, indicated specific operations and achievements that could never be publicly acknowledged. "This is not a tattoo you can fake," Reeves explained to the crowd. "Each element represents verified service with Team 3, operations confirmed through classified databases that require the highest security clearances to access." The visual proof hit Commander Vance like a physical blow. He had spent the last hour publicly destroying the reputation of someone whose actual service record made his own career appear insignificant by comparison. The professional consequences of this mistake would follow him for the rest of his military life. Danny approached his grandfather with new eyes, beginning to understand why certain questions had never been answered, why certain boxes in the house had always remained locked, why his grandfather had always deflected conversations about his military service. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Ezra's voice was gentle but carried decades of weariness. "Son, some stories can't be told. Some service has to remain silent." Other veterans in the crowd began to recognize the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Several SEAL veterans came forward, their bearing shifting to respect as they recognized one of the foundational figures of their community. These men understood the price of classified service and the sacrifice of serving without recognition. Admiral Reeves gestured for silence as he prepared to deliver his final statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed something that should never have happened, but perhaps some good can come from it. Mr. Holloway represents thousands of veterans whose service cannot be fully acknowledged due to its classified nature. They served in silence. They suffered in silence. And too often, they're forgotten in silence. The ceremony had transformed from humiliation to recognition, from judgment to justice, but the personal cost to everyone involved, Ezra's forced exposure, Danny's confused pride, Vance's career-ending mistake, served as a reminder that some wounds, once inflicted, cannot be easily healed. The emotional weight of Admiral Reeves's revelation settled over the ceremonial hall like a heavy blanket, transforming what had been a routine graduation ceremony into something that would be remembered and retold throughout naval circles for years to come. The crowd sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed, not just the vindication of one elderly man, but the exposure of a systematic failure to recognize and protect veterans whose service transcended normal military recognition. Ezra remained standing beside Admiral Reeves, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick with the tremor that had marked his movements throughout the ordeal. Yet now, in the aftermath of truth, something had shifted in his bearing. The defensive crouch of a man under attack had straightened into the posture of someone whose burden had finally been shared. His watery blue eyes, which had earlier shown only resignation and dignity in the face of humiliation, now carried a mixture of relief and profound weariness. Danny approached his grandfather with halting steps, his young face cycling through emotions too complex for his 22 years to fully process. Pride warred with confusion. Amazement battled with a strange sense of loss. The grandfather he had known his entire life, the quiet man who had attended every school play, every baseball game, every milestone with gentle encouragement and few words about his own past, had been revealed as someone whose contributions to American security stretched across decades of classified operations. "Grandpa," Danny said quietly, his voice barely audible in the hushed hall, "I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell me, all these years, when kids at school talked about their grandfather's war stories? When I asked about your service, why the silence?" Ezra's response came slowly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of enforced secrecy. "Son, when you serve in the shadows, silence becomes more than habit. It becomes survival. The work we did, the places we went, the things we saw, they were classified not just for national security, but for the safety of everyone involved, including our families." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd that remained transfixed by this unexpected drama unfolding before them. Many were veterans themselves, and in their faces, Ezra could see recognition of the impossible choice between duty and family connection that classified service demanded. "For 50 years, he continued, "I've carried stories that I couldn't share with anyone. Not your grandmother, God rest her soul. Not your father before he passed. Not you, despite how much I wanted you to understand why your old grandfather sometimes woke up screaming, or why certain news reports would make me leave the room." Lieutenant Chen, still processing her role in uncovering the truth, approached with obvious respect. Her intelligence training had taught her to recognize the patterns of classified service, but seeing its human cost up close created a professional obligation she hadn't expected. "Mr. Holloway," she said carefully, "I want you to know that this incident is going to trigger a complete review of how we handle veteran identification and support. What happened today should never happen again." Admiral Reeves nodded in agreement. "Lieutenant Chen is correct. This has exposed systematic failures in our protocols. We've created a situation where our most classified veterans are also our most vulnerable to exactly this kind of mistake." The crowd began to stir, as the immediate shock gave way to processing the broader implications. Families who had initially been entertained by the confrontation now understood. They had witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about who deserved recognition and respect. The quiet, elderly man who could have been anyone's grandfather had been revealed as someone whose service had literally shaped the military capabilities they took for granted. Commander Vance stood apart from the groups forming around Ezra, his career effectively ended by his public mistake. The arrogance that had driven his attack on a perceived fraud had transformed into a humiliation far more complete than anything he had attempted to inflict. Admiral Reeves had made it clear that disciplinary action would follow, but the real punishment was the public nature of his error and the recognition that he had attacked everything he claimed to represent. Several SEAL veterans in the audience began to gather around Ezra, their conversations conducted in the specialized language of shared experience that excluded outsiders but created obvious bonds of brotherhood. These men understood the unique burden of classified service, the way it shaped every aspect of life, from relationships to career decisions to the simple ability to take pride in one's accomplishments. "Brother," said one, a man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades in special operations, "I trained on techniques you developed. We all did. The coastal insertion protocols, the intelligence gathering methods, the teamwork structures. They're all built on foundations your generation laid." Another veteran, younger but carrying himself with the distinctive bearing of SEAL training, added, "My father served with Team 2 in the 80s. He used to tell stories about the ghost operators from the early days, the ones whose names couldn't be spoken but whose techniques saved lives in every operation." These testimonials created a powerful counter-narrative to the humiliation Ezra had endured. Where Commander Vance had seen a fraud trading on unearned valor, the special operations community recognized a foundational figure whose contributions had rippled through decades of military evolution. Danny listened to these exchanges with growing amazement and a complex mixture of pride and grief. Pride for his grandfather's incredible service, but grief for the recognition that had been denied. The stories that couldn't be shared, the burden of carrying such weight alone for so many years. "I need to understand," Danny said to Admiral Reeves. "How many others are there? How many veterans are out there carrying classified service that can't be recognized?" The Admiral's expression grew somber. "More than you might imagine. Fewer than there should be. The nature of special operations is that success often means the mission never existed officially. These men and women served in the spaces between official policy and necessary action." Dr. Elizabeth Morse, the base psychiatrist who had been observing the proceedings, stepped forward with professional concern. "Admiral, if I may, this situation highlights the mental health implications of long-term classified service. The isolation, the inability to process traumatic experiences through normal support systems, the burden of carrying secrets that define your life but can never be shared. These create psychological challenges that we're only beginning to understand." Her observation added another dimension to the story unfolding. This wasn't just about military recognition or bureaucratic failures, but about the human cost of service that demanded complete sacrifice of personal recognition for the greater good. Ezra nodded slowly at Dr. Morse's words. "Doctor, you're describing something that many of us learned to live with, but living with it and being unaffected by it are very different things. The silence becomes part of you, but it also separates you from everyone else, including the people you love most." The admission created a moment of profound recognition among the veterans present. Many had struggled with similar challenges. The difficulty of maintaining relationships when core experiences couldn't be shared, the challenge of processing trauma without support systems, the burden of carrying the weight of classified knowledge that shaped world events but couldn't be acknowledged. Admiral Reeves took control of the moment, recognizing that the ceremony needed to move beyond crisis management toward positive action. "Ladies and gentlemen, while today began with a serious mistake, it's also presented us with an opportunity. Mr. Holloway's situation has exposed problems that affect hundreds of classified veterans throughout our system." He paused, scanning the crowd to ensure his message would be clearly understood. "Effective immediately, I'm establishing a classified veteran recognition and support program. Lieutenant Chen will head the initiative, working to identify and assist former special operations personnel whose service records remain partially sealed, but whose contributions deserve acknowledgement." The announcement created a ripple of approval through the crowd, particularly among the veterans who understood the significance of official recognition for a problem that had been ignored for decades. Ezra's response was characteristically understated, but carried deep gratitude. "Admiral, that's more than I ever expected to see in my lifetime. If this incident helps other veterans avoid what happened today, then perhaps some good will come from it." Danny remained close to his grandfather, still processing the transformation of his understanding about the quiet man who had raised him. "Grandpa, I have so many questions about your service, about the operations you can talk about what it was like carrying these secrets all these years. And I'll answer what I can," Ezra replied gently. "For the first time in 50 years, I can share some of these stories. Not all of them. Some will remain classified until long after I'm gone, but enough to help you understand why your old grandfather sometimes seemed to be carrying more weight than his frail body should be able to bear. The ceremony was drawing toward a close, but its impact would resonate far beyond the immediate participants. Video recordings of the confrontation and revelation would spread throughout naval communications, becoming a teaching tool about respect, proper procedures, and the complexity of veteran recognition in an age of classified operations. As families began to gather their belongings and process what they had witnessed, conversations buzzed with new understanding about the veterans in their own communities. How many quiet elderly men and women carried similar stories that couldn't be told? How many had served in ways that official records would never reflect? The lesson extended beyond military circles into fundamental questions about recognition, respect, and the assumptions people make about others based on appearance or accessibility of information. Ezra Holloway had looked like a frail old man playing dress-up in military clothing, but appearance had concealed decades of service that helped shape American military capability. Admiral Reeves concluded the formal proceedings with words that would be quoted in naval training programs for years to come. Today we've learned that heroism often wears the face of humility, that great service frequently goes unrecognized, and that our responsibility to our veterans extends far beyond what appears in official records. We must do better. As the crowd began to disperse, Ezra and Danny walked together toward the exit. Their relationship fundamentally changed by the day's revelations. For the first time, grandfather and grandson could share an understanding of what naval service truly meant, connecting across generations through common purpose and sacrifice. The burden that Ezra had carried alone for 50 years had finally been shared, transformed from secret shame into acknowledged honor. The price had been exposure and public scrutiny he had never wanted. But the result was recognition that he had never dared to hope for. Behind them, the flags at Naval Station Norfolk continued to fly at full staff, honoring all who served, including those whose stories were only now beginning to be told. 6 weeks after the incident that would become known throughout naval circles as the Holloway Recognition, the formal ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk drew attention far beyond the immediate military community. The story had spread through veteran organizations, military blogs, and news outlets that specialized in defense issues, creating a groundswell of interest in the broader problem of classified veteran recognition. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and crisp, with autumn colors providing a magnificent backdrop for an event that would mark not just individual recognition, but institutional change. Admiral Reeves had worked tirelessly to ensure that Ezra's formal recognition would serve as a model for how the military should honor classified veterans whose service could finally be acknowledged without compromising ongoing operations. Ezra stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting the same navy jacket that had triggered the original confrontation, but now his movements carried different meaning. The jacket had been professionally cleaned and pressed, its ribbons and insignia verified and properly positioned by a team of military historians who had spent weeks researching his service record. The weight of secret shame had been replaced by the lighter burden of earned recognition. Danny arrived early to escort his grandfather to the ceremony, their relationship transformed by weeks of careful conversations in which Ezra had shared what details he could about his classified service. The young sailor's understanding of his grandfather had evolved from simple respect for an aging relative to profound appreciation for someone whose contributions to national security spanned decades of dangerous operations. "Are you ready for this, Grandpa?" Danny asked, noting the mixture of anticipation and apprehension in his grandfather's bearing. "Son, I've spent 50 years avoiding this kind of attention," Ezra replied, his voice carrying both humor and underlying tension. "But I'm beginning to understand that some recognition serves purposes larger than personal comfort. If this helps other veterans, if it changes how we treat classified service, then it's worth the discomfort." The ceremony itself took place in Norfolk's largest auditorium, with attendance that stretched far beyond the original graduation ceremony. Witnesses, SEAL veterans from across the country, had requested permission to attend, creating an informal reunion of special operations personnel spanning multiple generations. The diversity of ages and backgrounds among the attendees illustrated the continuing evolution of naval special warfare capabilities. Admiral Reeves opened the proceedings with remarks that placed Ezra's recognition in historical context. Today, we honor not just one man's service, but acknowledge a debt that has gone unpaid for too long. Ezra Holloway represents hundreds of classified veterans whose contributions to American security remain partially hidden, not from shame, but from the ongoing requirements of national defense. Lieutenant Chen, now formally appointed to head the Classified Veteran Recognition Program, presented research findings that had emerged from investigating Ezra's case. Her team had identified over 300 veterans whose service records remained partially classified due to operational security requirements, many of whom had never received appropriate recognition for their contributions. The Holloway case exposed systematic gaps in our support systems, Chen reported. We discovered veterans who had been denied benefits, excluded from veteran organizations, and subjected to questioning about their service records because their classified backgrounds couldn't be verified through normal channels. Dr. Elizabeth Morse followed with findings from her psychological assessment program, which had been expanded to study the mental health implications of long-term classified service. Her research had revealed patterns of isolation, depression, and adjustment difficulties among veterans whose service experiences couldn't be shared or processed through normal support networks. The psychological cost of carrying classified secrets for decades creates unique challenges that we're only beginning to understand, Dr. Morse explained. Veterans like Mr. Holloway have borne not just the burden of their service, but the additional weight of silence about experiences that define their lives. When Admiral Reeves called Ezra forward for his formal recognition, the old man moved with careful dignity toward the podium, his walking stick tapping against the polished floor in rhythm that seemed to echo decades of measured steps through dangerous territories. The audience rose in spontaneous respect, creating a moment of profound acknowledgement that transcended military protocol. The medals and ribbons that Reeves presented represented recognitions that had been earned decades earlier, but couldn't be awarded due to operational security requirements. Each decoration carried specific historical weight: operations in Southeast Asia, counter-terrorism missions in the Middle East, training programs that had shaped generations of special operations personnel. These honors were earned through service that couldn't be acknowledged at the time, Admiral Reeves explained as he pinned each decoration. Today, we recognize contributions that helped shape modern naval special warfare capabilities, operations that saved lives and prevented terrorist attacks, and training innovations that continue to protect American interests worldwide. But the most meaningful moment came when Reeves presented Ezra with a special recognition created specifically for classified veterans, the Silent Service Medal, designed to honor those whose greatest contributions could never be fully disclosed. The medal's design incorporated symbols representing the three pillars of classified service: sacrifice, secrecy, and dedication to mission over personal recognition. Ezra's acceptance speech was characteristically brief, but carried profound weight. His voice, strengthened by weeks of preparation and the support of his newfound military community, reached every corner of the auditorium with clarity that belied his age. For 50 years, I've carried stories that I couldn't share with anyone. Today, I can finally speak about some of what we accomplished. Though much must remain classified for the protection of ongoing operations and the safety of personnel still serving in dangerous places, he paused, his eyes scanning the audience that included his grandson, his military brothers and representatives from every branch of service. The work we did was classified not because we were ashamed of it, but because its effectiveness depended on secrecy. Every successful mission was one that the American people never knew they needed protection from. His words created a powerful framework for understanding the paradox of classified service, that the greatest successes were those that prevented crises rather than resolving them, missions that succeeded precisely because they remained unknown to those they protected. Today's recognition isn't just for me, Ezra continued, but for every veteran whose service record contains gaps that can't be explained, whose experiences can't be shared, whose sacrifices have gone unacknowledged. We served in the shadows not from choice, but from necessity. The emotional climax came when Ezra directly addressed the young sailors in the audience, including his grandson. Your generation will face threats we couldn't imagine, but you'll also have tools we could only dream of. Remember that the greatest service often goes unrecognized, that the most important victories are the ones that prevent wars rather than win them. Following the formal presentation, a reception allowed for more personal interactions between Ezra and the special operations community that had gathered to honor him. These conversations revealed the depth of his influence on naval special warfare development. Techniques he had pioneered were still being taught. Operational principles he had developed continued to guide mission planning, and leadership approaches he had modeled remained standard in SEAL training programs. Master Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez, a SEAL veteran with 30 years of service, approached Ezra with obvious respect. "Sir, I want you to know that every SEAL who has served in the last 20 years has benefited from foundations you helped establish. The coastal insertion techniques, the small unit tactics, the intelligence-gathering protocols, they're all built on work your generation did." These testimonials continued throughout the reception, creating a powerful narrative about the continuing impact of classified service. Ezra's contributions hadn't ended with his retirement, but had continued to influence military capabilities through the techniques and principles he had helped develop. Danny stood beside his grandfather throughout these exchanges, finally understanding why certain objects in the house had always been off limits, why his grandfather had deflected questions about his military service, and why the old man had sometimes seemed to carry weight that his frail body shouldn't be able to bear. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of an official naval history that would include Ezra's declassified service record, ensuring that future generations would understand the contributions of classified veterans to American security. The document represented institutional acknowledgement that had been decades in the making. Admiral Reeves's closing remarks established principles that would guide future classified veteran recognition efforts. "Today we've learned that heroism often wears the face of humility, that great service frequently goes unrecognized, and that our responsibility to our veterans extends far beyond what appears in official records." As the formal proceedings ended, Ezra and Danny walked together across the base, their relationship fundamentally transformed by the day's events. For the first time in 50 years, Ezra could walk with the bearing of someone whose service had been acknowledged, whose sacrifices had been recognized, and whose contributions had been validated by the military community he had served. "Grandpa," Danny said as they walked, "I'm proud to carry on the family tradition, but I hope I can serve with even half the courage and dedication you showed." Ezra's response carried the wisdom of decades of service and the relief of finally being able to share it. "Son, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And dedication isn't about recognition. It's about serving something larger than yourself, whether anyone ever knows your name or not." The story of Ezra Holloway had evolved from personal humiliation to institutional change. From individual recognition to systematic reform, his willingness to endure public exposure of his classified service had created opportunities for hundreds of other veterans whose contributions had remained in the shadows. Behind them, the flags at Naval Station Norfolk flew at full staff, honoring all who served, including those whose stories had finally been given voice after decades of enforced silence. The ceremony had ended, but its impact would continue to ripple through military communities and veteran support systems for years to come. The quiet old man who had been attacked as a fraud had been revealed as a founder of modern naval special operations, his recognition serving as a bridge between classified service and public acknowledgement, between individual sacrifice and institutional memory. In the years that would follow, the Holloway Recognition Program would identify and support hundreds of classified veterans, ensuring that silent service would no longer mean forgotten service, and that the price of national security would no longer include the complete erasure of those who paid it. This story reminds us that true heroism often goes unrecognized for decades, hidden behind classification levels that protect operations but sacrifice the operator's recognition. The bonds forged in classified service create obligations that extend far beyond official duties, connecting generations of warriors through shared sacrifice and common purpose. Would you like another story?